He built a life where emotions had no place and money solved everything, until the day he saw 4 little girls being thrown out of his own hotel, and one of them looked him straight in the eyes and said, "We don't have a home." Henry Brooks was never the kind of man to waste time. His life was mapped out in 15-minute increments, his phone rarely left his hand, and even his thoughts moved in the rhythm of quarterly goals and investment returns. He built his empire with sharp precision, and now, standing at the top of a hotel chain that stretched across the country, he believed he had everything under control. That morning, dressed in his signature navy blue slacks, crisp white shirt, and matching tie, Henry arrived unannounced at one of his flagship hotels in the city. It was part of a routine he called field efficiency inspections, but everyone knew it was about fear. Staff hurried to stand straighter. Managers gave tight smiles. No one wanted to be the next to face his wrath if anything was even slightly out of place. The sun was just beginning to reflect off the high glass walls of the lobby when he stepped out of the sleek black car and made his way toward the front entrance. But before he could even reach the doors, something strange caught his eye, a commotion near the revolving doors, where a security guard stood waving his arms and scolding someone. As he got closer, Henry slowed. The guard was pointing toward the street, voice sharp, posture angry, and in front of him stood 4 little girls. 4 very small girls. They were standing in a tight cluster, barely reaching the height of his waist, each of them dressed in a simple, worn cotton dress, a different color for each, soft pink, pale yellow, sky blue, and lavender. Their blonde hair was tangled from wind, and their faces were flushed with exhaustion or fear, he wasn't sure which. One of them clutched a frayed stuffed animal. Another held onto her sister's hand so tightly their knuckles had gone white. The guard looked ready to shove them out the door. Henry stepped in without thinking, his voice quiet but firm. "What's going on here?" The guard hesitated, then straightened. "They've been sitting in the lobby for hours. They don't belong here. No adult, no reservation. I was told to clear the space." Henry ignored him and crouched down to the girl's level. He rarely bent for anyone, but something about them, their stillness, the quiet way they huddled together, held him there. He asked, gently, "Where is your home?" One of the girls, the one in blue, looked up at him. Her eyes were large and brown, far too serious for her age. She didn't speak right away. Then she said, with the tiniest shake of her head, "We don't have one." The words didn't hit him all at once. They landed slowly, as if his mind was trying to reject the implication. 4 small girls, alone, homeless, standing outside his luxury hotel like shadows in a place built to shine. He glanced at the front desk, where no one seemed to be moving to help them. Guests passed by without looking twice. He stood and said to the guard, "They're coming with me." The guard blinked, confused. "Sir?" But Henry didn't explain. He motioned for the girls to follow, and without a word, they did. They trailed behind him quietly, stepping onto the marble floor as if unsure whether they were allowed. He led them to the sitting area in the corner of the lobby and told the nearest server to bring water, sandwiches, and blankets immediately. Then he sat with them, still in his perfect suit, with their tiny legs swinging over the edge of the chair, and for the first time in a long while, Henry Brooks stopped thinking about profit, loss, or control. He simply looked at them, 4 girls who had nowhere to go, and felt the silence in their eyes speak louder than anything he had ever heard. Henry sat with the 4 girls in the quiet corner of the hotel lobby, watching them eat with the kind of cautious hunger that suggested they weren't used to having food offered without consequence. The sandwiches were gone within minutes, the small water bottles emptied almost as quickly. None of them said much, though the youngest, he guessed her name was Lily from the way the others called to her, kept looking at him curiously between bites. She seemed fascinated by his tie, the silver watch on his wrist, even the way he sat. The others, Sophie in pink, Emma in lavender, and Grace in yellow, were more guarded. They stayed close to each other, responding to questions with nods or quick glances rather than words. But even in silence, their bond was obvious. They moved like a unit, 4 pieces of one story that hadn't yet been told. Eventually, Henry asked the question that had been sitting heavily on his mind. "Where is your mother?" The oldest, Emma, looked up then. Her voice was quiet, almost mechanical. "She's in the hospital. She's been there a long time." Sophie added, "She was in a car crash. We were staying with our aunt." The pause that followed made Henry's skin tighten. Grace finished the thought. "She said she'd be back in an hour. That was 2 days ago." Henry felt something inside him go still. No one had come looking for them. No one had checked in. These girls had been abandoned, left to wait for someone who never returned, until hotel security decided they didn't belong. And now they were sitting in front of him, eating the first real food they'd had in days. He tried to keep his voice steady. "Do you know your mom's full name?" Lily piped up without hesitation, as if proud to know something the others didn't. "Hannah Roberts. She sings to us. She says that's why we have pretty names. Like in songs." He took out his phone and opened a private directory, quickly searching local hospitals. Within minutes, he found a patient listed under Hannah Roberts. ICU. Serious condition. No emergency contact listed. No one had claimed her. Henry sat back, absorbing the weight of it. She had once been the woman he thought he'd marry. That was 6 years ago. They had parted when their lives took different directions, he into ambition, she into something softer, more grounded. He hadn't heard from her since, hadn't tried to follow. And now here she was, unconscious in a hospital, and her daughters, his daughters, were sitting across from him, unaware of the storm that was about to unravel. He didn't say anything to them about it yet. Instead, he stood and spoke calmly to the hotel manager, arranging for a private suite on the top floor. The girls needed a bed, a bath, safety. Social services had been notified, but he made it clear they were not to remove the children until he had spoken directly with their case officer. The manager, wide-eyed and confused, nodded quickly and followed his instructions. When the girls saw the suite, their expressions changed. Lily squealed and ran to the window to look at the skyline. Sophie carefully folded a towel from the bathroom like it was made of gold. Emma and Grace sat on the edge of the bed, unsure if they were allowed to stay. Henry knelt down and looked at them evenly. "You can sleep here tonight. I'll be just down the hall. And tomorrow, I'll take you to see your mom." None of them asked who he was or why he cared. They didn't ask what would happen next. They simply nodded, as if something in them already trusted him more than they trusted the rest of the world. That night, for the first time in a decade, Henry didn't return to his penthouse. He stayed in a hotel suite with 4 sleeping children under the same roof. And as he sat in the dim hallway outside their door, keeping watch even when no one asked him to, he realized he wasn't thinking about stocks or deadlines or reports. He was thinking about how easily 4 little girls had changed the entire direction of his life, and how strange it felt to want nothing more than to be part of theirs. The next morning began earlier than usual for Henry. He hadn't slept much, and not because of the discomfort of the hotel armchair where he had dozed off, but because his mind wouldn't settle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the 4 girls, how they had eaten in silence, how they had clung to each other, how none of them had cried, even when talking about being left behind. That kind of stillness in children wasn't natural. It came from learning too early that no one would come if you cried. He stood quietly in the hallway outside their suite, not wanting to wake them too soon, but unable to walk away. When the door finally creaked open and Sophie peeked out with sleepy eyes, he smiled without meaning to and asked softly if they were hungry. She nodded once and disappeared back into the room. Breakfast was served in the suite, a mix of pancakes, fruit, and hot chocolate the staff brought up with an extra dose of kindness now that they understood the situation. The girls sat around the small table, still in oversized hotel bathrobes, laughing quietly as Lily tried to blow bubbles in her cocoa. Henry watched from a chair near the window, a strange calm settling over him. He had never once imagined himself in a room like this, not as a father figure or a protector, and yet everything about the scene felt like it fit. Not perfectly, but naturally, like a space in his life had always been waiting for them. After breakfast, he told the girls gently that they were going to see their mother. Their laughter quieted instantly, and a shift moved through the room. Emma looked at him sharply. "Is she awake?" He hesitated before answering. "Not yet, but the doctor said she's doing better." "I thought you'd want to see her anyway." None of them spoke, but Lily got up and took his hand. That was answer enough. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Henry had arranged for a private car and asked one of his assistants to handle all of his meetings indefinitely. He didn't know how long this situation would stretch, and for once, he didn't care. Work could wait. These children couldn't. At the hospital, a nurse greeted them kindly and led them to the ICU waiting area. The girls huddled close together on one bench while Henry spoke to the doctor. Hannah Roberts was stable but still unconscious. She had suffered multiple internal injuries and a traumatic head injury. The fact that she had survived was already considered a medical triumph. When Henry asked if she would wake up, the doctor gave a careful, non-committal answer. "There's hope," he said. And sometimes, especially with cases like hers, the presence of familiar voices can help. Henry returned to the waiting area and told the girls they could go in, one at a time. Emma went first. She held her mother's hand without speaking, just stared at her and then leaned in to whisper something no one else could hear. Sophie went next, sitting by the bedside with a kind of still reverence, as if afraid any sound would break their mother more. Grace brought a drawing she'd made at the hotel, tucking it under her mom's pillow without saying a word. And Lily, the last to go, crawled gently onto the edge of the bed, lay down beside her mother, and whispered, "I missed you the most." After they left the room, the girls stayed curled up together on the waiting room couch, worn out by the weight of seeing someone they loved in such a fragile state. Henry spoke to the social worker assigned to the case and requested emergency custody, citing that he was both a legal guardian and someone with the ability to provide full-time care and stability. The woman was skeptical at first. Wealthy men didn't typically volunteer for responsibilities like this, but after seeing how the girls leaned into him and how he spoke about them, she promised to push the paperwork through faster than usual. That night, back at the hotel, Henry helped them get ready for bed. He read them a story, poorly, with the wrong voices and no rhythm, but they laughed anyway. When the lights were off and they were all tucked in, Emma asked him, "Are you going to leave too?" The room went quiet. Henry walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. "No," he said. "Not now. Not ever, if you'll let me stay." She didn't reply, but she didn't look away either. And when he stood up, she grabbed his hand and didn't let go for a long time. That night, as the city blinked outside the tall hotel windows and four girls slept soundly in a room that felt safer than anywhere they'd been in months, Henry Brooks finally admitted something to himself. His life before them had been full, but not meaningful. His money had built empires, but these girls, without asking for anything, were quietly teaching him how to build a heart. By the end of the week, Henry had memorized the sound of each of the girls' footsteps. He could tell when Lily was coming by the soft, skipping rhythm of her little feet and how she always hummed when she walked. Grace moved more carefully, as if afraid she might break something she couldn't fix. Sophie was usually quiet but fast, especially in the mornings, and Emma, ever the oldest, even if only by minutes, had a deliberate, almost protective stride that made her seem older than 5. These details lodged themselves into Henry's mind without effort, like the way a father learns his children without ever deciding to. It wasn't intentional. It just became true. The temporary suite he had arranged for them at the hotel was beginning to feel like home, despite its formality. The girls had drawn pictures that now lined the walls, crayon portraits and hearts taped beside expensive light fixtures. Their shoes cluttered the entrance, and stuffed animals lined the edges of the beds. Henry no longer flinched when things were out of place. He didn't notice the smudges on the mirror or the fingerprints on the coffee table. He noticed the way Grace's face lit up when she managed to tie her shoes alone, the way Sophie tucked a blanket around her sisters every night, and how Lily always asked if she could sit on his lap when he read to them. He kept his phone on silent now, only checking messages once or twice a day. His executive team had grown used to the new version of him, the one who no longer barked orders or demanded midnight updates. His assistant sent polite daily summaries, which Henry usually skimmed and then ignored. Business still moved, but the urgency had disappeared. He had spent his entire career convincing himself that money was the only measure of value. Now, he couldn't imagine anything more valuable than brushing knots out of 4 little heads of hair each morning. Hannah remained unconscious, though her condition stabilized. The doctors were cautiously hopeful. Henry brought the girls to visit her every other day, letting them sit by her side, talk, sing, and draw quietly on notepads while he sat across the room. It was never easy. Emma always kept her hand on her mother's, like she was holding her in place with sheer will. Lily brought her little drawings and tucked them beneath the edge of the pillow. Sophie whispered stories. Grace cried only once, silently, when she thought no one was looking. Henry did see, but he didn't say a word. He simply handed her a tissue and sat beside her until the moment passed. Outside of the hospital, life began taking on its own rhythm. Henry started waking up early to prepare breakfast himself. His first attempts were terrible, burned toast, runny eggs, but the girls were gracious. One morning, when he managed to get the pancakes just right, Lily clapped like he had won a trophy. They began taking short walks in the park nearby, the girls chasing pigeons or gathering sticks and pretending they were magic wands. Henry never rushed them. He carried Lily when she got tired. He let Sophie hold his hand without asking why. He bought Emma a small notebook after she said she liked to write big thoughts, and he sat beside Grace while she colored in absolute silence, the two of them saying nothing and everything at once. One evening, while the girls were watching a cartoon and Henry was cleaning up from dinner, Emma came into the kitchen. She hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Do you know my mom?" Her voice was soft, but steady. He turned and faced her. "I did," he said. "A long time ago." She nodded. "She always said you were the only person who ever really listened to her." Henry felt something deep inside him catch. He knelt so they were eye level. "I want to listen now," he said. "I want to be here. For all of you." Emma reached forward and hugged him. It was not a polite hug or a brief gesture, it was full, strong, and trusting. He wrapped his arms around her, realizing that this, more than anything else, was what he had been waiting for his entire life. Not power. Not control. Just this, being needed by someone who still believed people could come back and be better. And in that quiet hotel kitchen, with the smell of syrup still in the air and the sound of cartoons in the background, Henry understood something he'd never felt before. He wasn't just a man helping children. He was part of them now. And they were becoming part of him. Henry hadn't expected the hospital to call that morning. He was sitting at the small kitchen table in the hotel suite, helping Sophie pour cereal without spilling milk on the counter when his phone vibrated against the wood. Normally, he ignored calls during breakfast, but something made him glance at the screen. When he saw the name of the hospital, his heart skipped a beat. He excused himself quietly, stepping into the hallway to take the call, and the moment the nurse said Hannah's name and the word "responsive" in the same sentence, he had to lean against the wall to steady himself. She wasn't awake fully, but she was breathing on her own. She had squeezed a nurse's hand when asked. It was progress, real, undeniable progress. He returned to the suite with a calm face, not wanting to get the girls' hopes up too high. But when Lily asked if they were going to see Mommy today, and he nodded, they erupted into excitement as if they had all heard the call themselves. That afternoon, he took them back to the hospital. The moment they entered the room, something was different. The machines were still there, still beeping, but the atmosphere felt less sterile. There was color on the table from drawings the girls had left earlier. The blinds were open slightly. Hannah's head turned slightly toward the door as they entered. Emma approached first and took her mother's hand again. "Mommy," she said, her voice small but clear. And this time, for the first time in what felt like forever, Hannah's eyelids fluttered. Her mouth didn't move, but her fingers twitched, and her eyes, glazed and unfocused, opened just enough to make Emma gasp. The girls stood still, almost afraid to believe it, until the nurse confirmed that Hannah was indeed regaining consciousness. Sophie began to cry. Grace hugged Lily so tightly it made the younger girl giggle through her own tears. Henry stood near the door, his chest tight, watching the impossible begin to unfold. Over the next few days, Hannah's recovery accelerated. She couldn't speak at first, her throat was too weak, her body still recovering, but she was present. She looked at each of her daughters with recognition, her eyes filling with tears as they talked to her, telling her everything she had missed. They brought her their newest drawings, combed her hair gently, and held her hands while singing quiet songs at her bedside. Henry stayed mostly in the background, letting the girls reconnect with their mother, but each time Hannah looked at him, there was something in her expression, gratitude, confusion, maybe both. Eventually, she asked for him. Alone. The nurse gave them a few minutes of privacy. Henry pulled a chair to the side of her bed and sat, feeling the weight of 6 years fall onto his shoulders all at once. Hannah's voice was raspy but steady. "They're safe," she said, her first full sentence to him. He nodded. "They are." She looked at him, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. Then she asked, "Why are you here?" He didn't answer right away. Then, with a quiet kind of honesty that surprised even himself, he said, "Because I didn't know they existed. And once I did, I couldn't not be." Hannah closed her eyes for a moment, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I didn't want to interrupt your life. I thought, maybe it was better this way." Henry leaned forward, speaking gently. "Better for who?" "For me? Maybe. But not for them. And not for you." She looked at him again, more steadily this time. "You stayed," she said. "All this time?" He nodded. "Every day." She turned her head slightly toward the window, the sunlight spilling across her face. "They love you already," she whispered. "I can tell. They trust you." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't try to fill the silence. Instead, he took her hand and held it, not tightly, just enough to remind her that she wasn't alone anymore. That night, when they returned to the hotel, the girls ran ahead into the suite, talking over each other about what color they wanted their new beds to be when Mommy came home. Henry stood at the door and watched them, something shifting deep in his chest. This was no longer a temporary arrangement. He wasn't just helping. He was part of their family. And whether or not he had planned for it, he wanted to stay for the rest. The hotel suite had transformed into something that barely resembled its original purpose. It was no longer a temporary shelter but a lived-in, warm space filled with signs of family life, soft toys on the couch, drawings taped to the glass balcony door, shoes scattered by the entrance, and the smell of warm oatmeal every morning. Henry had started waking up before the girls so he could have breakfast ready when they stumbled out of bed, their hair tousled, their eyes still adjusting to the light. It was a rhythm now, not born out of duty but choice, and each moment they spent together continued stitching him closer to them. Hannah's condition improved rapidly. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about her long-term recovery, though she would need time, therapy, and rest. The girls visited her every other day while Henry handled their schedules in between, school enrollment paperwork, doctor's checkups, and, to his own surprise, a growing list of bedtime story preferences. They had already outgrown the suite, and one afternoon while Lily napped and the others played with markers on the floor, he opened his laptop and began searching for a place, something more permanent. Not just for them. For all of them. One morning, Henry brought Hannah a small bouquet of flowers and sat with her near the hospital window. She looked stronger now, her voice firmer, her color back. The nurse had just helped her walk down the hallway for the first time in months. When she returned to the bed, Henry had been waiting. She smiled at him, more at ease than she had been in their earlier, tentative conversations. They talked for an hour, and not just about the girls, about the time they lost, about the versions of themselves they'd become, about how neither of them had imagined being in this place, but somehow, it felt more real than anything they had before. Henry didn't pressure her about decisions. He never asked where she would go or what she would do once discharged. Instead, he made it clear, through presence, not promises, that she didn't have to decide anything alone. That evening, back at the suite, Sophie asked him if their mom would come live with them again. Henry bent down and answered honestly. I hope so. But we'll only ask her if she wants that too. The girls didn't push. They accepted that answer the way children do when trust has been earned not by words, but by consistency. When Hannah was finally discharged, Henry brought her to the hotel himself. The girls had decorated the suite with balloons and hand-drawn welcome signs. Emma had folded a paper crown that she placed on her mom's head as soon as she walked in. Grace ran to the kitchen to offer her the cookies they had made that morning, slightly burnt but filled with pride. Lily took her mother's hand and whispered, "It's better when you're here." That night, when the girls had gone to bed and the suite was finally quiet, Hannah and Henry sat on the couch in the soft glow of a nearby lamp. She looked around the space and said, "You made this feel like home." He looked at her and replied, "No, they did. I just followed their lead." She was quiet for a long time after that, her fingers tracing the rim of a mug of tea. Then, softly, she asked, "Do you ever regret not knowing them sooner?" He didn't even hesitate. "Every day. But I'm grateful I know them now. And I'm not going anywhere." She smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder, and in that stillness, Henry felt something he hadn't known he'd been missing. Not just belonging, not just love, but the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The decision to move into a real home came gradually, not from a single conversation but from the way things began to grow out of the space they were in. The hotel suite, while once a safe haven, had become too small for the life that now filled it. The girls needed bedrooms of their own, places for their clothes and books and secret collections of shiny objects and crayon masterpieces. Henry noticed the shift one afternoon when Lily asked if they would always live in the room with the fancy lamps, and Grace asked if they could have a backyard. That night, after they were asleep, Henry brought it up with Hannah. They sat in the corner of the suite with the lights dimmed low and the city beyond the window glowing in amber and gold. Henry showed her listings on his laptop, houses in quiet neighborhoods with schools nearby, parks within walking distance, and kitchens that looked like they belonged to people who cooked more than they ordered out. Hannah listened, her expression unreadable at first, then slowly began leaning in, asking questions about window light and bathtubs and whether one of the bedrooms had space for bunk beds. She didn't say yes immediately, but she didn't say no either. That, Henry knew, was the beginning of something. Within a week, they found the house. It wasn't the largest or most luxurious, but it had warmth, wide porches, old trees, and a crooked path of stepping stones leading to a garden that begged to be rediscovered. The moment the girls stepped inside, they scattered in different directions, claiming corners and dreaming aloud. Emma stood in the hallway and said it smelled like cinnamon. Sophie found a window nook and declared it her reading spot. Grace asked if they could paint her room yellow. Lily ran into the backyard and shouted that they finally had grass. Henry moved them in himself, refusing to hire a team. He carried boxes, assembled beds, hung pictures drawn in crayon with tape, and set up nightlights in every room just in case. Hannah arrived a few days later, after finishing her final checkup. She didn't bring much, just a single suitcase and a bundle of framed photos, but when she walked through the door and saw her daughters dancing barefoot in the living room, she paused for a long moment, her hand on the frame, as if anchoring herself to reality. Then she stepped inside. Their first dinner in the house wasn't fancy. It was spaghetti with garlic bread and juice boxes because the dishes were still packed and the blender didn't work. But it was perfect. They sat on the floor around a borrowed table, laughing and leaning into each other, surrounded by boxes and the sound of something that had been missing for a long time: peace. After dinner, the girls helped clean up, placing their plates in the sink and racing upstairs to brush their teeth in their new bathroom. When Henry came up to say goodnight, he found Lily already curled under her blanket, her bunny tucked close to her chest. "Do we stay here forever now?" she asked. He knelt beside her, brushing her hair back from her forehead. "If you want to," he said. She nodded once and closed her eyes. Downstairs, Hannah was folding a pile of clean towels and placing them in the linen closet. When Henry came down, she smiled at him without speaking. There was nothing left to explain. They had built something fragile and real from the pieces of something once broken. And though they didn't know what every day would look like, they knew this: they were no longer moving through life separately. They were a family. And they were home. The morning of the girl's 6th birthday arrived with the kind of quiet excitement that always precedes something magical. The house was still and peaceful just before sunrise, but Henry was already awake. He stood in the kitchen, barefoot and in an old t-shirt, carefully lighting 6 little candles on 3 small cakes he had picked up the night before, one for each pair of twins who had somehow become the center of his universe. The kitchen smelled faintly of vanilla and strawberries, and the sky outside was just beginning to lighten, brushing the windows with soft gold. Hannah joined him a few minutes later, her hair pulled up and her hands still warm from sleep. She didn't speak at first. She just leaned against the counter beside him, smiling as he concentrated on balancing the candles so they wouldn't tip over. They had planned a small party in the backyard that afternoon, just the 6 of them and a few neighbors they had begun to trust. There would be balloons and a paper crown for each girl and a table full of messy, homemade decorations they'd worked on for the past week. But the morning belonged to the family. One by one, the girls woke up and padded down the stairs in their pajamas, eyes still puffy from sleep but lighting up the moment they saw the cakes. Lily squealed first, followed by Grace, and then Sophie and Emma, who tried to act more grown-up but were clearly just as excited. Henry didn't say much, he didn't need to. He just smiled and knelt beside the table, gesturing for them to make a wish before they blew out their candles. They closed their eyes with all the sincerity only children could offer, their faces serious, their little fingers laced together. When they opened their eyes again and blew out the flames, Henry clapped softly, and Hannah kissed the top of each of their heads. After breakfast, the girls scattered throughout the house with new art supplies and books while Henry and Hannah set up the yard. There were ribbons tied to tree branches, folding chairs covered with hand-drawn name tags, and a makeshift stage made out of wooden crates for Lily's birthday performance, which she had been rehearsing in secret. When the party began, it was everything Henry never knew he wanted: simple, full of laughter, and touched by a kind of joy that couldn't be bought or staged. The girls sang songs, played games, and at one point performed a short skit that involved a confused prince, a dancing dragon, and a lot of improvised dialogue. He laughed until he cried. As the sun began to dip low in the sky and the yard filled with the warm glow of string lights, Henry stood beside Hannah watching the girls chase bubbles through the grass. He thought about who he had been just months ago, the man who believed love was a distraction, that vulnerability was weakness, that success came only from control. That man had been powerful but hollow. This man, standing here in a backyard with frosting on his shirt and paint smudges on his arm, felt more whole than he ever had in his life. Hannah turned to him and took his hand, and in the quiet between them, she said something that made his heart feel both heavy and light. "They don't just need you, Henry. They chose you. Every single day." He looked at her, at the girls, at the life they had built from almost nothing, and realized she was right. He hadn't forced his way in. He had been invited. And now, he was staying. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep in a pile of blankets and birthday cards, Henry sat with Hannah on the back porch. They didn't speak for a long time. They just watched the moon rise and the house behind them hum with the soft sound of family. When he finally turned to her and asked, "So what comes next?" she smiled and said, "Whatever we choose." And in that moment, under a sky full of stars and a heart full of everything he never thought he'd find, Henry knew that this was not the end of their story. It was the beginning. He built his empire by never looking back, until the woman he once loved called after 5 years of silence, asking him to meet her at a hospital, and brought a little girl in a wheelchair with eyes just like his. Henry didn't speak at first. He couldn't. His mind was racing, trying to catch up with what his eyes and heart had already understood. The little girl in the wheelchair, Lily, had his eyes, his cheekbones, and the same way of tilting her head when she was curious. Sky stood between them like a bridge between two versions of his life, past and present, her hands gently resting on the back of the chair. She looked thinner than he remembered, and tired, not just from the day, but from something deeper and more enduring. "I didn't know how else to do this," she said, her voice low and steady, though Henry could see she was holding herself together with effort. "I didn't plan to tell you like this, or even to reach out at all. But I had no choice." She gestured to the hallway behind her. "She's been through so much already. Last year, she had an accident at the playground. Fell from a climbing structure, landed wrong. Spinal trauma. The doctors say there's a chance she could walk again, but the surgery is expensive. Too expensive. And insurance barely covers anything." Henry glanced at Lily, who was now looking down at her hands, quietly humming to herself and swinging a little plush bunny in her lap. She didn't seem to notice the weight of the moment hanging over the adults beside her. Or maybe she was used to it. Maybe she'd learned how to carry it without making others feel it. He shifted his gaze back to Sky, his voice coming out quieter than he expected. "Why didn't you tell me before? Why didn't I know about her?" Sky hesitated, exhaling slowly as if bracing herself for the answer she had practiced but never said aloud. "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "When I found out I was pregnant, we had just broken up. You were already disappearing into your career, and I didn't think you'd want this life. I didn't want to be a burden or a distraction from what you were chasing. And later, it just seemed easier to raise her on my own than to risk being rejected." She looked down at Lily, then back at him. "But now it's not about pride. It's not about fear. It's about her. And she needs help." Henry felt something shift in his chest, guilt, grief, something too large to name. He looked again at the child who had existed 5 full years without his knowledge. How many birthdays had he missed? First steps? First words? How much had she needed him when he hadn't even known she existed? He crouched slightly, bringing himself to Lily's level, careful not to scare her. "Hi," he said gently. "I'm Henry." She looked at him, blinked, and smiled. "Hi. You talk like me," she said, matter-of-factly, as if that was the most important thing to notice. Her voice was soft, but confident, her smile wide. "Are you Mommy's friend?" Before Henry could answer, Sky's voice cut in, tender and honest. "He's more than that, baby." Henry stood again, running a hand through his hair, heart pounding in his chest. The walls of the hospital suddenly felt too narrow. "Tell me everything," he said to Sky. "What the doctor said. What it costs. What she needs." Sky nodded, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly for the first time since he arrived. "I have it all. I didn't come here to ask you for money, Henry. I just didn't know where else to turn." "You don't have to ask," he said, his tone more certain now. "You won't do this alone." Skye looked at him then, not with doubt, but with a kind of guarded hope, and something unspoken passed between them. They had once shared something powerful, something unfinished. And now, standing in front of the little girl who unknowingly carried both their reflections, it was clear their story wasn't over. It had only just changed shape. Skye led him to a quiet bench near the hospital's courtyard, a small space with worn benches and a few tired trees, where the noise of machines and intercoms faded slightly. Henry followed in silence, his thoughts tangled in a way he wasn't used to. He was a man who dealt in logic, with years of hard facts and quick decisions behind him, but nothing about this moment fit into any category he understood. When they sat, Lily remained beside them in her wheelchair, now distracted by a butterfly that had landed on the armrest, humming a soft tune as if none of the tension around her existed. Skye folded her hands tightly, as though holding herself together by sheer will, and glanced sideways at him. She didn't rush her words. After we broke up, I didn't expect to find out I was pregnant. I wasn't planning to contact you because I thought it would make things worse, for both of us. You were on the edge of something big. I'd seen it. You were changing, moving toward a life that didn't include people like me. I didn't want to be the reason you slowed down, or worse, looked back. Henry didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. His eyes were locked on the child next to them, the child who had his exact shade of blue in her eyes and the same dimple that appeared when she smiled. Skye continued, her voice steadier now, but still carrying the weight of years of silence. I tried to do it on my own. For the most part, we were okay. Lily's a strong girl. Smart. Kind. She never complains, never even cried much when she was little. But then last year happened. She was at a friend's birthday party. Fell off one of those climbing structures. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a bruise. Then she couldn't feel her legs. She paused, the memory clearly hitting her hard, but she refused to let it break her voice. We went through a dozen specialists. They all said the same thing, incomplete spinal trauma. Not irreversible, but delicate. Risky. And incredibly expensive. The best shot she has is a procedure being offered at a private pediatric center across the state. The surgery, the rehab, everything together, over $400,000. Henry didn't flinch at the number. He could have transferred that amount in the time it took her to finish the sentence. What stunned him wasn't the cost. It was the fact that she had carried all this alone. That she had come to him only when the weight became too great to bear. Why didn't you try to find me sooner? He asked quietly, not accusing, but genuinely needing to understand. I didn't want your money, Skye said. And I didn't want pity. I wanted to protect her. I didn't want her to grow up thinking she was someone's accident or obligation. If I was wrong, if you said you didn't want anything to do with her, I wouldn't have survived watching her realize that. Henry exhaled slowly. The hospital, the courtyard, the questions, all of it pressed in on him, but nothing compared to the ache building behind his ribs. He looked at Lily again, who was now softly singing to herself, swinging her plush bunny by one ear. You weren't wrong, he said, his voice low, almost rough. About me changing. About leaving. But I was wrong about what mattered. Skye turned her head toward him, surprised by the confession. He met her gaze. I can't undo what I missed. I can't take back 5 years. But I can be here now. I want to be. Skye's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away quickly, wiping them before Lily could notice. She nodded slowly, not ready to fully believe it yet, but no longer running from the possibility. She doesn't know who you are, she said gently. Not yet. I told her a story once, about her dad. I told her he was smart and strong, and kind when it counted. She asked if he was real. I said yes, even though I didn't know if he still existed. Henry reached over and placed a hand lightly on the armrest of Lily's wheelchair. He didn't touch her, didn't want to scare her, but the gesture said what his voice couldn't yet express. "He does," he said quietly. "I just forgot how to be him." And in the stillness of that moment, with the spring breeze moving through the trees and the child between them unaware of how much she had already changed their lives, something old broke apart and something new, fragile but full of promise, began to take its place. Henry spent the next 24 hours in a state of quiet motion. His body moved through the necessary steps, emails to his assistant canceling all meetings for the week, phone calls to specialists whose names Sky had scribbled on a notepad, conversations with hospital administrators about transfer protocols and insurance coverage. But his mind was elsewhere, caught between the girl he couldn't stop looking at and the woman he'd once loved who had quietly carried the weight of both their choices. By the time he returned to the hospital the next day, he had arranged for Lily to be transferred to a private pediatric rehabilitation center known for its advanced surgical options and post-operative therapy. He'd spoken directly with the head of the surgical team, who agreed to prioritize her case. Money wasn't an issue. Time was. Sky met him in the waiting area, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and cautious gratitude. She hadn't asked for this, and he hadn't offered it as charity. There was an understanding between them now, unspoken but deeply felt. They were no longer strangers with history. They were parents. As the nurse rolled Lily out in her chair, holding a small backpack in her lap and her bunny tucked under one arm, she smiled at Henry without hesitation. "Are we going to the place with the big windows?" she asked. Sky had clearly told her just enough to keep her calm without overwhelming her. Henry nodded and crouched beside her. "We are. And I'll be there too, if that's okay with you." She looked at him for a long moment, as if testing the shape of that promise, then nodded. "Okay. But you have to sit by the window. I get carsick." Her straightforwardness made him laugh quietly, and something about her tone reminded him so much of himself it startled him. The drive to the facility was quiet. Lily dozed in the back seat, the gentle rhythm of the road and the soft hum of the engine lulling her to sleep. Sky sat beside her, glancing back every few minutes with the practiced movements of someone who had long learned to watch for signs of pain without drawing attention to it. Henry drove with a calmness he hadn't felt in years. He was used to urgency, to pressure, to making moves in minutes that affected entire regions of his business empire. But this felt different. He wasn't managing a crisis. He was holding something delicate. Something human. When they arrived, the medical staff greeted them quickly, escorting Lily inside for preliminary evaluations while Sky handled paperwork. Henry remained at her side the entire time, reading forms, asking questions, insisting on the best care without needing to raise his voice. Once Lily was settled in her room, which had a view of the gardens below, Sky sat on the windowsill and finally allowed herself to exhale. She hadn't cried in front of him yet, and she didn't now, but her silence was heavy with all the things she hadn't had time to feel. Henry offered her a bottle of water and stood beside her, unsure of whether to speak or wait. She broke the silence first. "I haven't felt this kind of fear since the night she fell. Back then, I thought I was holding my breath for a few hours, maybe a few days. I didn't know it would stretch into a year." Henry nodded, not pretending to understand fully, but willing to listen. "You shouldn't have had to go through that alone," he said quietly. "I should have been there. For both of you." Sky gave him a sideways glance, not filled with blame, but with a tired sort of honesty. "You weren't. But you're here now. And that matters more than I thought it would." Neither of them said much more after that. Instead, they stayed by the window, watching Lily sleep peacefully in a room that felt safer than the world had in a long time. That night, Henry checked into a hotel 5 minutes from the facility. He didn't go back to his penthouse, to the cold expanse of glass and silence that once defined his life. He wanted to be nearby, ready. He wasn't sure what he was yet to Lily, maybe a stranger with a promise, maybe a father in waiting, but he knew he wanted to earn his place. Not with words. With presents. And so he stayed close, in case she needed him. In case Sky did too. In case this was the beginning of something real. The following days settled into a strange but steady rhythm. Henry visited the rehabilitation center every morning before the official workday would normally begin, arriving with coffee for Sky and something small for Lily, a coloring book, a puzzle, a packet of stickers shaped like stars. He was careful never to overwhelm or intrude, always letting Lily guide the pace of their connection. At first, she treated him like a friendly visitor, someone interesting but not essential. But slowly, day by day, something shifted. She began to look for him at the door before he even entered, her face lighting up whenever he appeared. She asked him questions, invited him into her playtime, and eventually, without any prompting, started calling him Henry in a way that held no distance at all. Henry found himself looking forward to every visit more than anything else in his world. His assistant, confused by his continued absence from the office, had tried to rearrange meetings, push back deadlines, and even offered to send a company jet if needed. But Henry responded with something his team had never heard from him before: handle it. I'm busy with something more important. It was the truth. For the first time in years, his life had meaning beyond control and profit. His priority had a name and a face, and she was learning to smile again. Lily's doctors were cautiously optimistic. The surgery had gone well, and she had begun responding to therapy with small signs of regained sensation in her legs. She still couldn't walk, but her therapists believed in her progress. The sessions were hard, emotionally and physically, but she didn't complain. Henry watched from the observation room as she struggled through balance exercises and painful stretches, sweat clinging to her forehead, eyes focused, jaw set with quiet determination. He saw his own intensity in her, not born of pressure, but of will. She had the fire of someone who had never been handed anything easily, and still refused to give up. One afternoon, during a quiet moment in her room, Lily asked him if he had any children. The question caught him off guard, and for a heartbeat, he didn't know how to answer. He sat beside her and said, carefully, I didn't know I had a child until I met you. But now I do. I have you. She looked at him for a long time, not with confusion, but with the seriousness only children could carry when the world didn't quite make sense. Does that mean you're my dad? She asked. Her voice wasn't afraid, just curious, like she was trying to draw the line from one point to another. Henry didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. If you want me to be. I'd like to be, Lily. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned back to her drawing, adding another flower to the page in front of her. Then, in the quietest voice he had ever heard her use, she said, okay. That was it. No dramatic moment, no music playing in the background. Just a quiet acceptance between two people who had been strangers and were now beginning something new. Later that evening, Henry found Sky outside on the bench near the garden, her coat wrapped tightly around her as the air turned cool. She looked at him, her face unreadable for a moment, then finally softened. She told me what you said. That you want to be her dad. He nodded. I meant it. Sky stared out at the horizon for a while before speaking again. I never thought we'd be standing in this place. Not just physically, but emotionally. Everything I thought was gone came rushing back the moment I saw you with her. Henry didn't ask what she meant. He didn't try to fix anything. He simply sat beside her and listened. That night, they didn't talk about the past. They talked about Lily's school preferences, her favorite cereal, the fact that she'd started asking for dance lessons once she could walk again. It was the kind of conversation parents had, full of the mundane details that carried enormous meaning when life had once been uncertain. And when Sky leaned her head gently on his shoulder, neither of them moved away. There was still a long road ahead. But for the first time, it felt like they were walking it together. By the 5th week of Lily's rehabilitation, something in the air had changed. The walls of the pediatric center no longer felt like a place where emergencies lived, but more like a second home, a space of hope and quiet effort. Henry now knew the names of the nurses and the therapists. He knew which elevator had the softest ride that wouldn't jostle Lily too much. He knew that she liked apple slices with cinnamon before therapy and that she hated when people called her brave just for smiling. He also knew that he had never been more proud of another human being in his life. Lily's progress, though incremental, was measurable. She could now stand for several seconds with support. She had begun taking tiny assisted steps with parallel bars, her arms trembling as they held her weight. Each time she pushed herself forward, she looked around the room, and if Henry was there, she would smile like she was doing it for both of them. He kept his distance during sessions, never interfering, but always there. He had learned that sometimes love meant simply being in the room. It was not about fixing. It was about staying. Skye had changed, too. In the early days, her posture had been tense, her voice soft from fatigue. Now she carried herself with steadier confidence. Her laughter came more easily, especially when Lily insisted on singing entire songs mid-therapy to distract herself from the pain. She and Henry had started sharing morning coffee on the hospital patio, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. One day she brought him a scarf because she said he always forgot to dress for the wind. It was such a small gesture, but when she looped it around his neck herself, it felt more intimate than anything they had shared in years. Henry's business world, meanwhile, had adapted to his new rhythm. His team had stopped asking when he would return to full capacity. The truth was, he had no intention of returning to that life, not in the way he had known it. Deals and deadlines no longer seemed urgent. What felt urgent was being there when Lily reached for his hand. What felt essential was learning how to braid hair, even if his fingers fumbled, or figuring out how to turn her hospital room into a place filled with color and light and music. One evening, just after dinner, Henry arrived with a surprise. It was a pair of shoes, small, white, simple. Shoes that could only be worn by someone who would walk in them. Lily gasped when she opened the box, her fingers tracing the curves of the soles like they were made of gold. "Are they really mine?" she whispered, her voice full of disbelief. Henry knelt in front of her, helping her slip them on. "They're yours. For whenever you're ready. I believe you'll walk in them." Skye watched from the doorway, one hand over her mouth. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes were glassy, her expression soft. After Lily had gone to bed, exhausted but glowing, Skye met Henry in the hallway. "You know," she said, she used to talk about her future like it was a storybook. As if all the good parts were meant for other people. Not anymore. Henry didn't respond right away. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn photo he had found just the night before. It was of Skye, taken years ago, smiling wide with wind-blown hair and holding a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. "I missed all the beginnings," he said. "But I won't miss the rest." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of time between them slowly giving way to something lighter. And then, gently, she took his hand. It wasn't a promise. Not yet. But it was something real. And for both of them, that was more than enough. The 6th chapter of their story began quietly, without announcement or fanfare, but the shift was undeniable. Lily was no longer simply progressing in her recovery, she was transforming. Her body, which had once struggled to respond to even the gentlest movements, was now cooperating in ways that stunned even her doctors. She had reached the point where she could walk 5 full steps with a walker, her legs trembling beneath her but holding. And each time she moved forward, her face lit up not with pride, but with joy, as if the world had returned to her one small miracle at a time. Henry had started staying longer, sometimes from morning through the late afternoon, working from his laptop in a corner of the therapy room or on the patio outside Lily's window. His life no longer felt like it was split between work and something else, it was all one life now, whole and deeply rooted in something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. He took part in everything, from therapy check-ins to parent support groups to weekend art sessions where Lily painted everything in shades of pink and gold. Other parents noticed, sometimes staring a little too long, as if trying to place him. To most, he looked like a man from a different world, with tailored clothes and sharp features and a presence that was difficult to ignore. But here, he was just Lily's dad. And the longer he stayed, the more he felt like he had always been. Skye had slowly let go of her cautious distance. She and Henry no longer tiptoed around each other in conversations or avoided difficult subjects. They spoke openly now, about the past, about the ways they'd both changed, and about the cracks that had formed between them all those years ago. One rainy afternoon, they sat in the hospital cafe while Lily napped upstairs, and Skye admitted, "I was angry at you for a long time. But the truth is, I never gave you the chance to know. I assumed you wouldn't care, and maybe back then, that was fair. But now you're not the man I remember. And I'm not the woman who left." Henry didn't argue. He simply reached for her hand, holding it lightly, not to convince her, but to say without words that he was here, and he wasn't going anywhere. One evening, as the sky turned a soft blue-gray and the city lights began to flicker awake, Lily called them both into her room. She was sitting up, her walker by her side, and her cheeks were flushed with excitement. "I have something to show you," she said, her voice trembling with anticipation. They stood beside her, watching as she gripped the handles of the walker and pulled herself to her feet. Without hesitation, she took 7 steps, slow but steady, crossing the room without falling. She didn't look down. She looked only at them. When she reached the other side, she smiled and said, "See? I told you I'd get there." Skye cried then, openly, her hand pressed to her heart as she knelt beside her daughter. Henry felt his throat tighten, unable to speak, overwhelmed by pride and awe and something deeper he hadn't known he was missing until now. That night, after Lily was asleep, Skye stood beside Henry outside on the terrace, her arms wrapped around herself against the breeze. "You gave her something I couldn't," she said softly. "You made her believe she could do more than just hope." Henry shook his head. "She did that on her own. I just stood close enough to witness it." Skye looked up at him, her expression no longer guarded. "I think we're not just getting Lily back," she said. "I think we're getting ourselves back too." And for the first time in a long time, there was no more pretending, no more waiting. There was only this, an imperfect but healing family, choosing each other day after day. Not because they had to. Because they finally could. Spring had fully arrived by the time Lily took her first unassisted steps outside. The garden at the rehabilitation center was blooming with pale yellow tulips and soft green leaves, and the air carried the warmth of a season determined to soften everything winter had left behind. Henry stood just a few feet away from her, watching as she moved carefully across the paved path, arms out slightly for balance. Each step was cautious but certain, and she wore the same pair of white shoes he had given her weeks earlier. She didn't look down. She looked at the trees, the sky, the world opening in front of her again. Skye was seated nearby on a wooden bench, holding her breath without realizing it, her eyes never leaving Lily's small frame. When Lily reached the end of the path, she turned around and beamed at them both. "I walked all the way," she said, as if they hadn't been watching every second. Henry and Skye clapped, laughed, and walked to her without hesitation. Skye scooped her up and spun her carefully, tears forming in her eyes. Henry knelt beside them, his hand on Lily's back, not saying anything because words felt too small for what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just progress. It was possibility returning to her eyes. Later that day, back in her room, Lily was drawing while Henry and Skye sat across from each other by the window. The air between them was different now, warmer, more open. Henry had noticed that Skye's laugh came easier these days, and she no longer glanced at the clock every few minutes like she had in the beginning. She had stopped looking for escape routes. She was starting to stay, not just in body but in spirit. Skye reached into her bag and pulled out a worn envelope. "There's something I want you to read," she said, sliding it across the table. Henry hesitated, then picked it up and opened it carefully. It was a letter she had written to him but never sent. The date in the corner was just 2 months after Lily was born. In it, she told him about the day their daughter first smiled, the sound of her laugh, how she slept with one hand curled beside her cheek. She wrote about being scared, about missing him, and about choosing not to send the letter because she didn't want to risk breaking again if he didn't answer. Henry finished reading and looked up at her, the paper still trembling slightly in his hands. "You kept this?" he asked. "All this time?" Skye nodded. "I guess part of me always hoped I'd have a reason to give it to you someday." There was silence, then a kind of peace that settled over the room. Henry folded the letter slowly and placed it in his jacket pocket. "This means more to me than you'll ever know," he said. That night, Skye and Henry took Lily for a walk through the garden again, this time hand in hand. Lily skipped ahead occasionally, her steps light and joyful, calling out the names of flowers she'd memorized. Skye looped her arm through Henry's without thinking. He didn't look surprised. He just held on. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light across the garden path, Henry felt a sense of stillness he hadn't known in years. Not the empty kind he used to chase in silence and solitude, but the full kind, the kind that comes when every piece of your life, even the broken ones, finally has a place to belong. He didn't need to ask what came next. He already knew. They weren't waiting for life to start anymore. They were already living it, one step, one moment, one shared smile at a time. The final chapter of their journey didn't come with a dramatic finish or some grand announcement, but with quiet, meaningful shifts that turned routine into something sacred. 3 months had passed since Lily's final therapy session, and her last day at the rehabilitation center was more celebration than goodbye. Staff lined the hallways with paper flowers and posters of encouragement, and Lily, walking unassisted in her favorite white shoes and a light pink dress, waved like a queen returning to her kingdom. She didn't need a walker anymore. She still got tired, and some days were harder than others, but her steps were hers now. Every single one of them. Henry stood just outside the double doors, holding a bouquet of spring tulips in one hand and a soft blue backpack in the other. Skye stood beside him, smiling through quiet tears, her hand wrapped around his. When Lily reached them, she wrapped her arms around both their waists without a word, just holding on. They didn't need to say anything. They knew what they had overcome. What they had built. They had lived each moment fully, and now they were stepping into the next one with nothing left unspoken between them. That evening, they didn't return to a hospital suite or a hotel. They went home, Henry's home, which didn't feel cold or hollow anymore. The rooms were no longer quiet, the walls no longer bare. There were drawings taped to the refrigerator and little shoes by the front door. A bookshelf in the living room now held both finance textbooks and children's storybooks. It wasn't just a home he had filled for Lily. It was one he had created for all of them. Dinner was simple, pasta and salad and fresh bread, but it felt like a feast. They laughed, passed plates, and shared stories. Afterward, Lily insisted they all sit on the floor in the living room for a family movie night, a tradition they had started at the hospital with a tablet and a stack of pillows. Now it took place on a big rug with a projector on the wall, and Lily curled between them with her stuffed bunny tucked under one arm and a bowl of popcorn balanced on her lap. At one point during the film, she looked up at them, her eyes sleepy but content, and said, "This is what I wanted the whole time." Neither of them asked what she meant. They knew. Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed, Skye and Henry stepped outside onto the porch. The stars were out, scattered across a sky that felt unusually close. Skye leaned into him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. They had stopped talking about the future in terms of what-ifs. Now they talked about schools, summer vacations, weekend plans. Not everything was perfect, but it didn't need to be. They had earned this peace, this slowness, this love that came not from fantasy but from choosing each other over and over again. Henry thought back to the man he had been just a few months before. A man who thought love was weakness, who kept people at a distance, who mistook success for fulfillment. That version of him had vanished the day he saw a little girl in a wheelchair beside the only woman he had ever truly loved. From that moment on, his life had stopped being a fortress and started becoming a home. And every step Lily took, every glance Sky shared with him, had stitched together a life he never dared to imagine. As the wind rustled the trees and the porch light hummed gently above them, Sky looked up at him and whispered, "Thank you for finding us." He didn't answer right away. He just kissed her forehead and replied, "You didn't need to be found. You were always mine. I just had to be ready to come home." And under that soft sky, with love wrapped around them like something they'd never again take for granted, they stood still and grateful, knowing they had reached not an ending, but the beginning of everything that mattered.